The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned that humanity has just 12 years to avoid climate catastrophe. With governments having failed so far to take effective action to combat global warming, many are now looking to science and technology to come up with ways of bringing temperatures under control. But what kinds of solutions are being devised and how effective could they be? Reporter Eric Campbell has been finding out.
We start our journey in a city moving on from carbon. Few places are as eager as Copenhagen to get power from wind, and even in this weather, from sun. Nowhere has been keener to ditch cars for bikes. Claus BONDAM is director of the Danish Cyclists Federation and a former mayor of this city. He's leading its push to be the first carbon-neutral capital by 2025.
I do believe that there is a strong political consensus in Denmark that we need to act. It's pretty cold right now, but we had an extremely hot summer. It didn't rain for 2.5 months here. But it made me think, is this right? Is there something going on? And I think we have to realize that something is going on.
Copenhagen has been breaking all records in traditional ways to clean the air. Now, according to this meter, 1,631 bikes have crossed this bridge this morning alone. In the past year, it's been 3,519,062. It's extraordinary. But the problem is, no matter how much we ride, no matter how much we recycle, no matter how fast communities transition to renewables, it's probably not going to be fast enough. Because governments aren't meeting the commitments they made at the Paris Climate Change Conference to cut emissions. The politics are failing, which is why there's now such an urgent push to try new technology, to experiment with things that sound like science fiction, but could be the only way to ensure a secure future is a fact. The warning was sounded in October by the IPCC, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Co-chair of Working Group 1.
Leading scientists said carbon needed to be almost halved from 2010 levels to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Otherwise, runaway temperatures would destroy the Great Barrier Reef, droughts and hurricanes would become the norm. Melting ice sheets would flood major cities. But ice climatologist Jason Box, a former lead author to the IPCC, says even that won't be enough.
It's frightening, and I'm sorry to say this, but at 1.5 degrees of global warming, we still have like 2.5 degrees of summer Arctic warming, and that pushes Greenland beyond its threshold of viability. So we still lose Greenland, but at a slower rate.
Based in Copenhagen, he measures ice retreat for the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland.
When we lose the reflective cover of the Arctic sea ice, when we lose the Greenland ice sheet, the climate system globally unravels. And it's going to create the kind of problems that will make it pretty hard to govern society. The migrations, the droughts. So what's at risk here is practically civilization.
Professor Bock shares the frustration of all scientists contributing to the IPCC.
8, 7, 6.
Evidence gathered through years of painstaking field work is often just ignored by politicians.
Politicians and governments that dismiss IPCC reports, that's not conservative It's not progressive. Certainly, it is insanity.
He fears the world will need massive technological fixes called geoengineering, literally re-engineering the Earth to hold back what's coming.
For example, we can slow down melting of the Antarctic ice sheet by piling up sand on the seafloor simply to block warm currents that are already destabilizing the whole West Antarctic ice sheet.
Other ideas include covering oceans with iron filings to encourage carbon-eating plankton, or sending ships round the world to pump seawater mist into the sky to diffuse the sun's rays.
We have some ideas, and we need to try several technologies and evaluate them and figure out which are the least risky, et cetera, to get the carbon curve, which is like this now, to get it negative. And that all needs to happen in the next 10, 20 years to start down that path. It's extremely ambitious.
The idea of geoengineering has excited both scientists and industry. On the other side of Copenhagen, I've come to meet a prominent political scientist, Dr. BJORN LOMBORG.
They did it by using lots and lots of coal.
He's a favoured commentator in conservative media for arguing against major cuts to fossil fuels.
And I would say, look, if you say to people there's another solution, yes, it is going to take the attention somewhat away from the original solution. But we should also be honest and say, we've tried the first solution, namely ask people, could you please use the car less? Could you please use less energy? Could you please turn off your lights and all that? And it's not worked for 30 years. And actually, there's about half a planet who's waiting to get more energy availability. By the way, can I
Dr. LOMBORG says he accepts that fossil fuel emissions are warming the planet. He just thinks geoengineering will cool it much faster than switching to renewables.
Because it's so cheap, it's very likely to happen sooner or later. Some Indian billionaire or some Saudi billionaire is going to do it all by himself. Just turn it down a little bit to pre-industrial temperatures or wherever we decide to have it, and that would be essentially avoiding a large part, not all, but a large part of the global warming problem.
So, what are the most likely fixes, and would they really work?
Most of these globally ambitious projects are still on the drawing board, but one surprising new technology is up and running in a place generally seen as neutral territory.
It's long been a home of precision innovation. From Swiss watches that never lose time, to Swiss army knives in a country permanently at peace.
A small company here in Zurich believes it's found what could be a big part of the solution to climate change.
CHRISTOPH GEBALD and Jan Wurzbacher were PhD students when they decided to form a world-changing company. Tonight, they're celebrating CLIMEWORKS' 9th anniversary.
So we're still not making money. So, of course, money is not the motivation. The motivation is solving a big challenge. And there is probably as little as challenging as climate change.
Their solution is building giant fans that draw in air and bind carbon molecules onto filters. The carbon-free air is released back into the atmosphere. The CO2 is superheated and collected as gas.
I like to call it low-tech, not high-tech. It is actually very simple. The challenging part is making it work and making it cheap.
In just 2 years, they've opened plants in Switzerland, Iceland and Italy. They believe they could remove 10% of the carbon the IPCC wants cut. Their first target is 1% by 2025.
It's like 300 million tons of CO2, and that would require 250,000 machines.
But in this developmental stage, removing just 1 ton of carbon costs an uneconomical $600 US.
We are confident that in the next 2 to 3 years, we will halve our cost to in the range of 200 to 300. per ton. And in the mid to long term, and that's for us 2025 to 2030, we see costs as $100 as feasible.
So, the big question is, what do you do with all this captured CO2? Well, fortunately in this case, there's a greenhouse just 300 metres away. So after the carbon's sucked in to the fans, it's piped underground to the greenhouse and turned into veggies.
Plants absorb carbon, so the greenhouse buys the gas as fertiliser. Since it started spraying, crop production has increased by 10%. The quicker the process can turn a profit, the more likely it is to spread round the world. Even in frosty Switzerland, there's a real sense of urgency about limiting global warming.
I came here for the mountains, to climb, to ski, and in the Alps you could see very early signs of climate change. Like, of course, glaciers are disappearing, like we won't stop that if with and without climate change, but the speed of disappearance is shocking.
Patrick Hofstetter from the World Wildlife Fund took us out to see the disappearing glaciers. The Alps are warming more than twice as fast as the rest of Europe. Over summer, there was unprecedented drought.
Yeah, that's really special for us. The farmers don't know the situation yet. The grass stopped growing, so there is a shortage in feed. They actually started to slaughter their cows much earlier. After this really dry summer, I can feel a renewed sense of urgency, especially also because the farmers now really accept that they are directly affected by it.
3 hours from Zurich, we come to what used to be the start of the giant Notoriously glacier.
So this all used to be solid ice, this track?
Actually, 160 years ago, the glacier came up to here, so...
All the way to the town?
All the way to the station down here, yes.
Okay.
Since then, it's retreated by 3 kilometres.
1900, it was back to here.
And 600 metres of that in just the past decade.
1940, 1970.
This ancient glacier is expected to disappear entirely within a lifetime.
So are all the glaciers in Switzerland receding?
The predictions show by end of this century, most of them will disappear completely. Only a few will remain in the very top mountains.
The changing climate is already hurting the economy. Many ski fields are now bare until after Christmas.
This is a new situation we face. For the last 10 years, it got later and later. They have to do a lot of snow machine to prepare all the downhill slopes.
Even at higher altitudes, ski resorts are laying giant insulation sheets over glaciers to preserve snow.
From May to October, more or less, they cover it like that, and they remove it in October and start to ski again.
They're covering glaciers with blankets to try to stop them melting.
Well, it's actually just slowing down the process, so it's not a solution. It's just to fight the symptoms of climate change. We have been doing geoengineering now for many, many decades in actually burning so much fossil fuel and altering the climate by humankind that we have to look now in a similar scale into solutions to that problem.
As high as we are here, some believe the real antidote to climate change is 20 kilometres up there. At our next stop, we're meeting scientists who don't want to put blankets on glaciers. They want to blanket the atmosphere.
In the hallowed halls of Harvard University, researchers are looking at just how practical and dangerous geoengineering might be.
So in here we have one of the big pieces of test equipment that we use in preparation for putting instruments into the stratosphere.
Engineering professor Frank KEUTSCH is preparing for the first test mission later this year.
Open it up.
Okay.
And so we can put instruments into the vacuum tank, and then we can simulate the stratospheric pressure. So you have it 20 kilometers.
They'll use a high-altitude balloon to scatter sun-reflecting aerosols across the upper atmosphere. Right now, they're fine-tuning equipment to measure the effect.
It feels a bit like the space race.
In a way it does, on a much smaller scale. They fly up into the stratosphere high above us.
The whiteboard theory is that tons of tiny sulfur particles delivered by specially modified planes would lower the Earth's temperature.
Will result in cooling the planet.
It's what happened naturally in 1991 after the Philippines' Mount Pinatubo volcano erupted.
And this gas then reacts in the stratosphere with oxidants and turns into sulfuric acid. For the few years after Mount Pinatubo, the temperature was noticeably lowered and it cooled down the planet. That was one effect that you got from this.
By what degree?
It was, it's probably in the range of about ½ degree Celsius.
Trouble is, a quick fix like that could have nasty side effects.
And what was also apparent after Mount Pinatubo and other volcanic eruptions is that these particles, in the end, reduce the amount of ozone in the stratosphere. So, we've been trying to do a lot to actually fix the ozone layer. And here you now have the idea of introducing something that could destroy it again.
And it's not just those risks that make this project controversial. It's the fear held by many of the scientists themselves that just the suggestion of a magic bullet gives governments an excuse to keep pumping up emissions. So, Gernot, you've been running the numbers on this. I mean, is it economically feasible?
Part of the problem is just how much cheaper this geoengineering would be than switching to renewables.
If anything, it is too cheap.
Economist Gernot Wagner is the project's executive director.
It's so cheap that we are talking about single-digit billions of dollars to potentially influence the entire planet's climate.
Now, if I was running a fossil fuel corporation, I'd be thinking, great, this can solve the problem and we can keep digging up coal.
And frankly, that's the problem, right? So, yes, you might consider that sort of vested interest would in fact be very interested in something like this as, yet another excuse not to cut CO2 emissions.
I very often compare stratospheric geoengineering to painkillers. This does not fix the problem, right? It does nothing about CO2 to first order. We're just reducing symptoms, and then human nature can kick in and say, well, it's hard to deal with changing the energy infrastructure, which is very true. It's a huge problem. So in the end, any decision will always have to be based on imperfect knowledge.
Do you ever feel like this is playing God?
It is. There's a huge amount of hubris in this idea of saying, well, we've caused a problem, let's fix the problem, and I know how to do this. We're going to do this, and we know exactly what's going to happen to the whole planet. Yes, it has a lot of that. It's actually quite unsettling, and quite frankly makes me quite anxious.
This can provide endless possibilities.
Whatever geoengineering can achieve, the IPCC says the most carbon-intense fuel should still be phased out by 2050. At our next stop, we'll see how the industry is fighting back.
And it can now reduce its emissions by up to 40%.
Houston is a city built on carbon. Mining fossil fuels is as much a part of Texan culture as raising cattle or boot scooting. But these days, big energy is trying to sidestep demands to cut production. Its response is a much-touted technology to cut the carbon footprint.
Well, today we're heading out to Texas's biggest power plant. It's a pioneer of what the industry likes to call
clean coal. This is Petra Nova. It's a coal-fired generator with $1 billion absorption tower.
Unit 8 is that last stack right over.
After the coal is burned, the emissions are pumped through it, and solvent collects much of the CO2 before it hits the atmosphere. But it's early days to get excited. The tower captures carbon from just one of the complex's 10 generator units. What's more, it doesn't actually reduce emissions overall. The captured carbon is pumped in liquid form into an oil field.
So you put CO2 in an oil field and you get more oil out.
Right.
As company spokesman David Knox explains, it breaks up stubborn deposits so they can extract more oil.
The CO2 has a tendency, it bonds with oil, and when it bonds, it makes it slipperier. And when it's slipperier, it comes off of the rock, that last bit of oil in there.
But if you're capturing CO2, but to get more oil out, aren't you actually increasing the amount of CO2 overall?
It would if we were increasing the amount of oil that's being used. But we don't actually have any impact on the amount of oil that's being used. The oil is the same amount being used. We're just increasing the domestic production, and we don't have to import as much oil from foreign countries.
The industry is looking at other options like superheating coal, but that still produces high emissions without cost offsets. This unit and a smaller one in Canada are the only ones at coal-fired plants using carbon capture commercially.
There is such a thing as clean coal, but it is only at these 2 units. The economics are very challenging. When will there be another one built? I'm not good at predicting the future, but we now know that we can build one on time, on budget.
The uncertainty hasn't stopped politicians insisting the industry is saved.
We have ended the war on beautiful, clean coal.
Even Bjorn Lomborg, a sometime consultant to Big Energy, is sceptical.
Well, clean coal has been a mirage for very many years. It would be wonderful if you could actually have all the benefits of the cheapest fossil fuel and cut the carbon emissions. But it turns out it's fairly expensive to do on the coal-fired power plant. That is, it actually takes out some of the energy that you would otherwise have produced. So it has real costs. And of course, you also have to store it securely. And there's been lots of conversations about that. We've not really seen it running, and we certainly haven't seen it running cheaply. So again, it's one of the things that we should investigate, but we're not ready to do it anytime soon.
Back in Copenhagen, ordinary citizens continue to do their bit for the environment. Dr. Lomborg doubts his compatriots would ever accept the real cost of abandoning fossil fuels.
Most people are not content to only be able to charge their phones or have their TVs running, or indeed their operating theaters in hospitals running when the sun is shining. And when the sun is not shining, the cost from solar panels is infinite. And likewise with wind turbines and when the wind is not blowing.
It's not true, this idea that when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing, we're not getting that energy, because when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, you can charge batteries. And so the frontier is battery technology.
No matter how fast the world switches to renewable energy, the age of untested, high-risk geoengineering could soon be upon us.
We don't get there by going neutral. For better or for worse, geoengineering is part of the mix going forward, because we cannot get to where we need to be by conservation alone.
It could be the last throw of the dice to save the planet. After decades of governments ignoring dire warnings, simply going green may not be going far enough.